Since the beginning of known history, the human family has been growing. For the past 250 years, this growth has increased exponentially, and during the great worldwide baby boom, world population grew even faster. Since the publication of Paul Ehrlich's 1968 book, The Population Bomb, many of us assumed that populations would always grow, and that this population growth would be all bad. But what most of us didn't realize is that while populations were growing, fertility rates were actually declining. And today, over 90 countries and territories have sub-replacement fertility rates, which means that unless something dramatically changes, the entire world population will begin to decline in the lifetime of today's young people. And the economic consequences of this can only be described as a demographic winter. And so we ask, why did fertility fall in the first place? What are the possible solutions? And is there any hope for turning it around? In 1751, Benjamin Franklin wrote that populations double every 20 years. No doubt he was right at that time. This statement influenced some of us to believe that populations always grow exponentially, but they can also decline exponentially. Surprisingly, as of 2004, most Americans, when surveyed, were still of the opinion that populations doubled every 20 years. But actually, in 1790, the U.S. population would already take almost 40 years to double. Part of the reason for this slowing, curiously enough, has to do with the Industrial Revolution.
Fertility has been falling in the U.S. and the world for a long time. The first demographic transition, we call it, started with the Industrial Revolution.
Once, particularly after child labor laws were introduced, children ceased to be an economic asset. People still had some, but they had fewer than they had before.
In countries that are rich, the value of children has declined to the point, that is, we don't need them for agricultural labor anymore, we don't need them to walk miles to get firewood, and so on. They become, instead of valuable economic commodities, they become expensive commodities one has to educate, take care of, and so on. And so we have seen in the rich countries a drop in the birth rate, a very healthy drop in the birth rate.
Now it's true, richer countries have more money to spend, but they also have greater aspirations because they're in richer economies. They want to spend more on themselves, adults, and they want to spend more on their children.
And the norms for having children then came way down.
Since the 1940s, U.S. economists began calling this fertility decline the first demographic transition.
Because countries, as they get more prosperous and more urban, that's the two things you see with progress, particularly in modern time, people have fewer kids.
But 18th century French scientists, who first observed the phenomena, had originally called it the first demographic revolution because it was a choosing of material prosperity over traditional religious and family values.
Unless other factors intervene, such as religious belief, for example, that a large family was a good, unless that intervened, urban families tended to have ever fewer children, and the urban environment was not terribly friendly to children. It made it much more difficult to raise children. So smaller families is closely associated with urbanization.
But regardless of the precise mechanisms of decline, what's now commonly accepted among demographers is that fertility began to fall as nations and people began to prosper. But more recently, there have been compounding causes of fertility decline.
What's not as well known is what happened later in the 20th century, in the 1960s, something called the second demographic transition. And this centered on changing roles for women. As women entered the workforce and there was greater gender equality, it changed all kinds of norms about families. And having children became more discretionary, and it was balanced off against working roles. And there was all kinds of social norms that you can track in survey data that changed in this period.
In the early 1900s, women could not vote and had limited educational and professional opportunities.
You know, there have been periods, or much of our history, whether it's in the U.S. or elsewhere, where women were not valued, not honored, not recognized, and where their gifts were not fully honored and acknowledged.
Even women who were the sole supporters of families often struggled to find the kind of work that enabled self-sufficiency. All of this would begin to change in earnest in the 1960s, and with it, many other things changed.
There's no denying that once we began to travel down the road towards gender equality and all the other changes associated with it, including birth control, everything changed. And most notably, I believe, the family changed.
In 1962, the FDA approved the birth control pill.
The sexual revolution and the women's revolution are completely tied up in each other. The sexual revolution couldn't have happened without the advances in birth control that we saw. And the women's revolution couldn't have happened without the advances in birth control. Because if a woman's going to go to medical school or have a career as a manager of a big box retail store, she has to be pretty sure that she can control her fertility. The women's revolution really has meant that lots more women can get advanced education, can have successful careers.
Without feminism, I wouldn't be where I am today. Most of the women who are out in the workplace today would not have the opportunities that they have. Certainly, our colleges would not be open to young women the way they are today without the influence of the early feminists.
As education levels for women rose, fertility rates fell. That's because, armed with college diplomas, many women chose professional careers over a more traditional family life.
It also has meant that people, both men and women, are more likely to expect women to contribute and to support themselves.
So as people come to redefine what motherhood is, we would predict that there would be changes in fertility rates.
The more successful women become in the workplace before they have their children, the higher the opportunity costs when they have their kids. So it's harder to leave work.
Beginning in the 1960s, the average age of marriage went up, and as it did, fertility went down.
The other thing that nobody realizes is that the age at which women have children has a huge effect on how fast the population grows and how fast it replaces itself. Just when people have children makes a huge difference, and having them late slows population growth. Having them early speeds it up.
Consider a couple that has twins at 20 years old, and then each of those children themselves have twins at 20 years old. This scenario would result in a population growth of 6 people in 40 years. But consider a second couple that has twins, but at age 40. That would, in the same time period, only increase the population by 2. There is one other way that the women's revolution seems to have contributed, if unintentionally, to lower fertility.
One of the sad aspects of my working in the nation's capital is that there are so many young people here in Washington, D.C. They have thought that career and material things were the most important thing to them. And I have had numerous conversations with young people who say, I really want to get married, but there's nobody out there. And what we're seeing is when they postpone marriage, the pool of likely partners shrinks dramatically.
We told our young women, Go to school, get as many degrees as you can, find the best job you can. Don't worry about the marriage piece. That comes later. That would just kind of happen naturally. We didn't put the focus on kids' social development in the broadest sense. We put it on their cognitive and on their cognitive development and on their work achievement. So that suddenly a lot of young women woke up at around age 30 and went, well, okay, but where's the husband? Or maybe it was 35, whatever age it was. Okay, where's the husband? It was as if that was supposed to happen naturally, and of course, it did not.
Intentional or not, an increasing number of women would never bear children. Clearly, much good has come from the women's revolution, but for multiple reasons, fertility was also adversely affected by it. The low-cost, highly available, and highly dependable birth control pill is thought by some to have triggered in 1962 both the women's revolution and what has come to be called the sexual revolution.
I think the sexual revolution is the most profound event of the 20th century, quite honestly. It may even be the most profound event of modern history. Everything changed because everything was predicated on a certain arrangement between men and women. Everything meaning marriage, the economy, education, religion, culture, entertainment, you name it. It was all based upon certain assumptions about what men and women do and what they should do. And the sexual revolution disrupted that.
There definitely was a sexual revolution, and you can see it very clearly in women's reports of their lives. If you talk to women who got married by about 1960, and ask them when they had their first sexual experience, a very substantial majority will say on their wedding night. If you talk to women who came of age in 1960 and later, a very much higher proportion will have been sexually active before marriage with somebody they did not marry. And so the women have more partners. Women who came of age after about 1960 have more partners, more likely to divorce, more likely to have worked than women who came of age in the 40s, the 30s, 40s, or 50s. Behavior changed. The world changed in ways that affected the choices people made about sex and marriage and childbearing and work.
Even in married couples, you see a radical decrease in fertility with the introduction of contraception. Of course, that's its very aim, is to reduce the number of children.
In fact, 70% of married women adopted the pill by 1972 in order to space their children and avoid unwanted pregnancies. But something that is less commonly understood is that when sex was separated from reproduction, marriage itself would change in our culture.
Historically, there had to be some social arrangement to connect people to the care of those children. And so long as sex produced babies, marriage was the most efficient and effective arrangement that any society could come up with to provide for the care of children. Once you separate the act of sex from reproduction, then that basis for marriage begins to erode. And that's essentially what birth control did. We've had birth control for all of human history, but I'm talking about effective birth control such as the birth control pill of the 60s.
When marriage declined, non-marital cohabitation for many took its place, and the result of this was yet further fertility decline.
Once you take the sexual act outside of marriage, you very quickly get an imperative that there be no children.
Cohabiting couples tend to have fewer children than married couples, and it also pushes the age of marriage up and up.
It's more than just availability of contraception, it's the spirit of the age in some ways, which didn't really diminish much in the 70s either. But I think it wasn't sort of an anti-religious movement so much as it was an anti-authority movement, and throwing off of conservative norms wherever they come from, right? And the family itself was a conservative institution.
Although the sexual revolution had enabled the women's revolution, women's rights advocates warned of a dark side. As early as 1971, in the inaugural edition of Ms. Magazine, Gloria Steinem wrote that the sexual revolution was not a woman's revolution, but rather men trying to get easier sexual access to women.
Young men are no longer motivated to marry and assume marital responsibilities for the sake of sexual gratification. This is something that's readily available anyway. And so what we have is a kind of situation in which there's increasing evidence to the effect that we have a lot of especially cohabiting relations between young men and women, in which the woman is hoping for marriage, is hoping the relationship's going to develop into marriage, and in which the male has no plans for marriage with this particular person. It's simply an arrangement of convenience in which he can get his companionship and sexual needs satisfied, and he keeps the terms of the relationship ambiguous deliberately. And it's basically a kind of exploitation of the female.
The sexual revolution reduced fertility because it meant fewer people were motivated to marry, and those who did marry chose to have fewer children. But it cannot be said that one generation alone was to blame for fertility decline.
We're blaming baby boomers for lots of things. But really, if you look at divorce rates, they peaked right around the end of the Second World War.
Divorce rates were very high during World War II and around World War II. A lot of people married quickly and then divorced when men came home. And then divorce rates fell during the 50s.
When did you think we saw the next spike in divorces? Roughly 20 to 25 years later, right, after this big divorce peak. So it really is sort of the sins of the fathers visited upon the next generation, right, 25 years later. And so, I mean, divorce is a learned behavior, just like marriage is a learned behavior.
In 1968, at the height of the sexual revolution, then California Governor Ronald Reagan signed the first no-fault divorce bill into law. When other states quickly followed, the divorce revolution was born.
In the 60s and through the 60s, through the early 70s, there was a movement by states toward away from fault-based divorce toward what was called no-fault divorce. No-fault divorce is really unilateral divorce. It means that either spouse can end the marriage at any time for any reason. And there's some research that suggests that the change to no-fault divorce led to an increase in the divorce rate of something like 20%. Just lowering the costs of something, as any economist will tell you, increases the number of people who will buy it.
Divorce swelled to almost 50% in the United States, and it also spread to other countries.
Divorce is become more and more common, not just in the United States, but also in developing countries, in countries which traditionally divorce was not common. For example, in China. In 2006 alone, China had 1.9 million couples divorced.
Why would an upswing in divorce rates affect fertility?
If any marriage that you contract has a 50% chance of ending in divorce, and if having children is something you do with your spouse that is, if anything, a liability in a next relationship, then, and if a woman is mostly going to be left supporting these children on her own or with reduced financial circumstances, then it's a risk to have any children and a risk to have additional children.
Also, people get older. Like, it takes time to get married. It takes time for a marriage to fall apart. It takes time to get divorced. It takes time to find a new spouse if you're going to remarry. And in between, the biological clock has aged. So of course, there's going to be much less probability of pregnancy and new life.
Ultimately, all the causes of fertility decline seem to blend and merge together.
And I'm trying to speak to the change that has occurred in the last 30, 40 years. We've seen what I would call an anti-marriage revolution. In the U.S., it's best understood if you look at the history of the no-fault divorce movement, which led to a skyrocketing increase in the divorce rate. That's leveled off a little, but not much, and a big increase in unmarried cohabitation.
I think it's complicated. In the United States, I think that part of what's happened is the women's revolution, the divorce revolution, the sexual revolution.
All of that happened kind of on the tide of a big individual rights movement that started off for very good reasons. In the civil rights movement, addressed some issues that needed to be addressed about women, but then there were some extremists who took the individual rights theory way too far.
And I think the growth of individualism, which everybody agrees has happened in this country in recent years, everybody agrees it's happened in most modern societies, if not all. I think this is really the main reason that marriages have become less stable.
Individualism would eventually emerge as a single unifying theme.
There you butt up against post-materialist society. We love our things, we love consumption, we love the self, and those things are not consonant with love of children, love of family, love of things that are beyond the self.
Population grows older, they have less children, they focus more on themselves, and you see ultimately a nation that stops having babies.
I mean, I'm a sociologist. All around me I see social norms, social processes, things that involve more than just me, right? Organizations, institutions, but trying to convey that to a generation that has not been socialized to think of anything outside of themselves as making claims upon them is a real challenge.
People need reasons to have children. They've known today, and they've known for a long time, how to avoid having children. If there's no economic incentive to having children, people won't unless something other than economic incentive gives them a reason.
Ultimately, the rise in individualism has meant the decline of both fertility and families.
The decline of marriage, which again I think is a consequence of the values revolution of the 1960s and early 70s, clearly has a relationship to fertility. The creation of a large family almost never happens through a cohabiting couple. That's extremely rare in modern times. The family that commits themselves to having children is almost exclusively the married couple family.
Well, almost every young person today lives in a family that's smaller than those of previous generations. In many countries today, it's the one-child family is the norm. 2 children are the most you'll typically see in any Western family. And of course, as recently as a generation or two ago, it was not uncommon to have families 5, 6, 7, 8 kids.
I would say that there really is a conflict at the heart of our culture between marriage and its unchosen, involuntary obligations, and that's on the one hand, and on the other hand, our individualism.
In looking for causes of fertility decline, we have learned that various social megatrends, including cultural changes towards individualism and away from family life, seem to be at the foundation. And because falling fertility is causing economic decline, one might say that the decline of the family is at the heart of demographic winter.
No, we don't need large traditional families that much.
Do we need it? I don't think so.
No. For me, I'm still figuring that out.
Not really.
I'm married, but we don't have kids. We're considering children, but I think the definition of tradition is sort of changing.
I think people belong to various faiths or various countries that define marriage in different ways, and to me it's not important.
Everybody should be strong individually, and of course a good father and a good mother is very important, but the bigger the family becomes, the more problem also starts to create.
I don't think it's really modern to have a big family in these times, so I don't think it's really necessary to have a big family.
Whether or not we realize it, family decline may be causing fertility decline. And if it is, what will this mean for finding an economic solution to demographic winter? Fertility decline causes economic decline. But before we look at increasing fertility as a possible solution, let's look anew at increasing human capital. The one last hope for improving the economy, short of fertility increases, has been human capital improvements, including educational. But if family decline is at the root of fertility decline, then human capital improvements may be more difficult than we might otherwise expect. Here's why.
The broken family, and there are many different forms, have less human capital, provide less human capital to their children. It can induce less human capital in their child than the intact married family.
Because we know from more and more studies that much of the cognitive skills, the IQ type of skills, and many of the non-cognitive skills, the knowledge that you have to get to work on time, do your homework, and these things are so important for success. They are formed very early. Cognitive skills by age 3 or 4, non-cognitive by a little later ages. And in those formative periods, the family structure, all the studies suggest, is not the only factor involved, but it's certainly important. So yes, those children born in those environments are at a significant disadvantage compared to children born in traditional two-parent caring families who spend a lot of time with them when they're young, and by age 6 or 7, they're way ahead of the other children.
Most kids who grow up in a single mother household, I was raised by a single mother myself, most kids who are raised by a single mother or raised in a step family, for instance, turn out okay. That's in fact true. At the same time though, and we have to be, I think, very honest about acknowledging this, kids who are raised outside of an intact married household are much more likely to experience problems.
If weakened families disadvantage children, an ever-growing number of children are being born into them.
The percentage of out-of-wedlock births grows, and now is up to nearly 40%.
And this growing disadvantage is leading to growing social and economic inequality.
Income inequality is growing, and those with lower levels of income are those typically with less stable and less two-parent families, which exacerbates the disadvantage of those children. Over time, the range of disadvantage is growing, and the degree of dispersion in our society for the children at the one end of the spectrum and the other is greater.
Well, the gap between the children born, like you say, to single mothers or raised in families with single mothers whose fathers aren't interested in them, is a real problem. It's a problem for these mothers, of course, and it's a problem for the family, but it's also a very important problem for the children.
Do these problems have a measurable effect on the economy?
You have a significant fraction of children, maybe 20–25% of the children, who are not prepared to engage in the modern economy. They don't have the skills to do so, cognitive and non-cognitive. And the average child, even the average capable child, it's very difficult to overcome that disadvantage. And that's, I think, one of the major consequences of the family structure, and this whole problem of learning begets learning, and neglect at early ages is compounded at later ages.
Experts have hoped that, short of improving fertility, we might find an economic solution by improving human capital growth. But if human capital experts tell us that strong families are essential to human capital growth, and if family decline is responsible for fertility decline, then we may find that we can't fix human capital or fertility decline without fixing family decline. And still, human capital isn't the only hoped-for solution that is diminished by family decline.
The decline of the family affects the economy because it's the family that generates the human capital and the social capital and the moral capital.
Social capital refers to the network of people around me that I can count on and that can count on me to be there for them in various ways.
What we call moral capital also is a very important element. Where there is no moral capital, there is no credibility, there is no trust within the economy, and therefore economic activity is very difficult.
The family is the cradle of moral capital and of social capital. You can think of it as the family is the place where people learn their basic moral principles, but it's deeper than the moral principles. It's inside the family that people learn to cooperate with one another, where they learn to trust, and really where the groundwork for the conscience is laid in the first place.
And that's the only way that you can have any kind of, not only an economy, but any kind of society, that is to take care of what is your basic unit, which is not the individual, but the family.
Whether we try to improve our economy via fertility increases, or human capital increases, or social or moral capital increases, there may only be one root solution: strengthening families. Tradition holds that throughout history, the family has been the fundamental unit of society. It was within newly formed families that a majority of men and women met their most basic needs. It was within families that the next generation was born and raised. Groups of families became cultures, and combined cultures became civilizations. And human civilizations were sustainable because at their foundations were families, which could replenish themselves as older generations passed away. what if, at the very time that our entire civilization no longer values families, we begin to realize how important they really are? And what if the traditions about families were correct?
The Universal Declaration of Human Rights was the first statement ever issued by the United Nations.
It's a document that was signed by all the countries in the world essentially at that time, and it was non-controversial.
You'll see that it says the following: the family is the natural, fundamental group unit of society and is entitled to protection by the state.
In 1948, families were seen as so fundamental to society that major nations of the world vowed to protect them. But by 1968, many of us had begun to assume that there would always be plenty of others. In fact, too many others, willing to marry and to bear and raise children. But were too many children born? And now, what is our hope for fixing the demographic winter?
Some years ago, I looked at the issue of low fertility and asked the questions, what can governments do? Can governments try to have all sorts of incentives and encouragements to raise very low birth rates?
For a dozen years, governments have offered baby bounties, cash bonuses if their citizens would have more children. Italy, $15,000 per child in some cities. Japan, $5,000 per child. Russia, $9,000 per child, plus $140 per month, plus 40% of a woman's previous salary to stay home with the child. These measures aren't working.
На самом деле причины всего этого, они более глубокие. Я пытался об этом немного сказать. И задача гораздо более тяжелая, чем вот, как это воспринимают некоторые, даже многие. И как это воспринимает, к сожалению, наше правительство.
And you look at it, and it's very, very difficult to raise fertility. Some demographers have said in the past it's much easier to bring down fertility than to raise fertility.
A financial focus on raising fertility doesn't seem to be working. Ironically, the more money we have, the fewer children we seem to want. But more recently, members of the European Union have tried a different approach. Policies that strengthen families.
I have to admit that we started to pay serious attention to our family policy after we admitted that we are facing the demographic catastrophe.
There is a very recent report of the European Economic and Social Committee, which was just approved a couple of months ago by an overwhelming majority of the committee, urging the member states of the European Union to implement family policies.
We, as the policymakers, think that the best way to improve the demographic situation is by strengthening the families.
Since these efforts have been undertaken, there has been a slight increase in fertility rates in some European countries. To be sure, there's a heightened awareness of demographic challenges.
Yeah, I think we need traditional families to help you to fit in with society well.
Yeah, I'd agree. I think it's good support network.
Well, I think family values are really important. I mean, who doesn't want to get married and have kids and live that family life? I think it's important.
Families in general are a big support for the development of every child in this world. So I think a large family would help to have a better society.
Well, I think it's concerning that we have an aging problem, that there's lots of older people and
not so many
young people. So we have to work
very hard
and
long.
and
to pay for those people.
It's important, and I think families today are often just a few people, and lots of people can't afford to have lots of child, and lots of people don't want to live together in big traditional families, but I think the traditional family values are very important, and it would be good if there would be more families like that.
Look, I think it is. I've got 8 people in my own family, and it was made growing up very interesting, and I think having that many people now with all the cousins and whatnot going forward, it was really important to me.
If I believe in traditional family, yes, definitely.
Well, I think that's a pretty good answer, and yeah, I tend to agree. Yeah, lots of siblings means, I guess, lots of friends and people to do things with growing up, and yeah, I think it's a really positive thing.
Now here it's normal to have just one kid and that's it. And I believe in bigger families, like 4, maybe.
But the real question is whether or not fertility rates will continue to rise in Europe. And will pro-family policies alone be enough? Sociologists do not think so.
What has to be done is the culture needs to turn around somehow and value families and value children and value marriage more than it does now.
Paradoxically, one problem keeping us from valuing children more is that most of us don't live with children.
100 years ago or more, 75 or 80% of all households had children. There they were, in the next room, growing up, and you thought about what was best for them. You organized your life around what was best for them. You allowed cultural messages in the home that was suitable for them. Today, we are down to around 1/3 of households with children, 2/3 of households without children, and many of those, permanently without children. I just think that has been a major force in shifting the focus of people's lives.
If our focus has shifted away from children, the popular culture seems motivated, if unintentionally, to keep us distracted.
All of popular culture, for the most part, is driven by advertising, and the advertisers are trying to appeal to the young people. And that means before they are married. And that's when they're forming their tastes and decide which toothpaste to buy and which soap to get and so on. And if you wait too long, then people are already fixed and it's hard to change people's attitudes. So the popular culture is very focused on the lifestyle and values and attitudes and beliefs of young people who don't have children and are not yet married.
But there is less commercial reasons why creating a family-friendly culture may be difficult.
As I said any number of times to you already, I think we are so much defined by our individualism. We Americans are so much defined by our individualism, are so proud of being people who make up our own minds and design our own lives and do as we see fit, that we're going to have a problem finding the language to say your individual choices have enormous social impact. It's just a lesson that people don't want to hear.
Indeed. What we find is that even discussing family lifestyles is an extremely sensitive topic.
One of my friends in human development at Penn State was being interviewed about a study she did. She was interviewed by Wolf Blitzer, who also had in the studio this cohabiting couple, right? And so she's hauling out all this data and saying, this is pretty incontrovertible stuff, right? This is clear where we're headed. And the cohabiting couple were like, the fellow said, it's so funny. He said, I just want to send a message out to all those people who are cohabiting not to listen to all the data collection analysis that's going on and just be true to yourselves and to each other. I mean, really, it's sort of the juxtaposition of fairly neutral data-based claims versus intensified moral debate about what should be allowed, what should be encouraged.
Put those two things together and you have a rather bleak future. I'm not quite a declinist as much as some people are, but I guess I'm sort of a perpetual optimist about these things. But I must say it is hard to see how these things are going to be turned around.
Changing our popular culture to be family-friendly will be hard. Our culture, after all, is defined as the majority values, beliefs, and assumptions that we hold. So a majority of us would have to reconsider what we believe and why. And this reveals one final problem with changing our culture. The vast majority of us care about the environment. But since 1968, we have assumed that large families are necessarily bad for the environment.
Well, when people first learned that world population is growing ever more slowly and on the point of depopulation, a lot of people think, gee, that's great. We've got too many people in this world and too much traffic.
Yeah, a lot of people I've talked to about this say, well, isn't it great if the birth rate is going down, because after all, that's fewer carbon footprints and less stress on Mother Earth.
Thus, we could only change our culture if we were to recognize that the relationship between population growth and the environment may not be as straightforward as we thought.
You know, what I would say is somebody who's been working on this subject for a number of years now, I mean, the one thing you learn right away is that there are no easy answers. That, for instance, if you think that we're facing a climate crisis, and we face it because there are too many of us, well, as soon as you begin to actually probe and do a bit of research, or just to ask some questions of those who would tell you we just have to reduce our numbers to make our environmental problems go away, you quickly discover that it's more complicated than that.
The environment does have many stresses upon it, stresses that we put upon it that we don't need to. But the problems that we're having with global warming, for example, aren't strictly speaking the result of population increase. It's instead changes in the way people live. So the population of cars in the world, for example, is a big, big problem. The population of people isn't per se.
So that's why, you know, most people who really work on these kinds of issues will say it's not about the numbers. There are far fewer Americans in the world than there are Indians or Chinese. But you know what? It's the Americans who are having the far and away biggest impact on the world's climate.
If environmental experts are beginning to say that environmental care isn't necessarily about the numbers, then perhaps there is at least one way that even large families can be seen as possible environmental solutions, rather than as certain environmental problems.
My wife and I have 9 children. We have gotten comments from, do you run a preschool? The answer is, well, yes, in a way, but they're all our kids. To, don't you know that having so many children ruins the environment and causes global warming? And of course we respond, no. Our children will grow up to help protect the environment. They'll be good conservationists. That's what we're teaching them to do. And that if we ever do have a problem with global warming, which I don't believe we do, that my children may be the scientists who help to solve it.
The strengthening families who want to responsibly bear and raise children could provide the growing human capital that we need for future green innovations. Furthermore, strengthening such families could also strengthen our economies to afford such innovations, while helping to avoid a demographic winter. In summary, cultural and environmental assumptions would need to change in order for families to be strengthened on a general scale, and for fertility rates or human capital levels to come up. As daunting as this might be, there is hope, so long as enough of us can see the value of families as fundamental units of society. For all of human history, populations have grown. Beginning 250 years ago, populations began to grow exponentially, and after the baby boom in 1968, we began to believe that populations would always grow, and that this was necessarily bad. But while we have been worried about overpopulation, the seeds of eventual depopulation have long been taking root. In fact, fertility rates have fallen in rich and poor countries by 50% in the last 50 years. Some populations are already beginning to decline, and by 2065, the entire world is likely to begin depopulating. And if we thought that depopulation would be all good, we now know that the economic problems created by falling fertility can only be described as a demographic winter. And when we look for causes of fertility decline, we see the major social megatrends of modern times, but our collective valuing of individuality over the family is a cultural theme that may be common to all causes, which is to say that family decline is at the root of fertility decline. And if this is so, then other than population growth, our last hope of economic growth may be human capital growth, but it is also diminished. And thus we may need to strengthen families in order to strengthen our economies and thaw the demographic winter. Pro-family policies are helping, but ultimately our entire culture must change to be supportive of families. And that is made doubly difficult, because in our modern cultures, both family values and large families are assumed to be problems rather than potential solutions. So is there any hope for overcoming demographic winter? The answer is yes, if we can enable a culture-wide strengthening of responsible families. But if we don't strengthen families, are we facing the eventual decline of the entire human family?
Well, one of the tricky things about this question is if people are not having enough children as a whole to replace the population, does that imply eventual human extinction? And I think the answer actually is no, because there are children still being born. It's just that they're disproportionately being born to people of faith. That's true whether we're talking about Orthodox Jews or fundamentalist Christians, fundamentalist Muslims. Around the world, people of the book tend to have larger families than their secular counterparts, which implies in a world in which many people have no children or only one, that the world of tomorrow is going to be much more a world of faith and of eventual demographic spring. And if it helps, just so you know where I'm coming from, I'm not churched. I work for a progressive secular think tank, right? And you can say this in your documentary in terms of. You're saying it's actually. Oh, okay. I have one child adopted. So, I'm not, this is not a faith-based analysis. This is an analysis that may eventually bring me to faith, but is not driven by faith. It just turns out these were the facts take you when you look at population.